Thank you, Simon. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here today. I'll move right into the presentation. What I want to touch on today is a very brief background on Mars Incorporated, and then talk specifically about the challenges that exist within the global cocoa supply chain, but also then a focus on West Africa and Cote d'Ivoire. And I'll go into more detail about our Vision for Change program in the Ivory Coast. I think one of the key things to know about Mars Incorporated, we're a global business, and yet we are a family-owned business. We're one of the largest family-owned businesses now in the world. We operate around global segments, so I hope you would recognize some of those brands. And the ones we want to talk about today are the chocolate brands, and especially around the supply chain that gives us the cocoa beans that we need to make those products. As a family business, Mars operates against a set of long-held policies and principles. These principles were created at the beginning of the business way back in the 1930s, and it's something that every associate takes very seriously. In terms of the supply chain work that I'm involved in, the one that we really key in on is mutuality. I think the easiest way to think about mutuality is that Mars seeks to have a sustainable and mutually rewarding supply chain for everyone involved in it. So when we found out that the cocoa farmers around the world struggle so much to make money and to have their children in school, and to instead they're working in the fields, it was something that we knew we had to get involved in. Now, a brief background on cocoa. It's a small commodity, but it is a global commodity. And you can see that it is centered primarily in West Africa, but the largest producing country is the Ivory Coast. It produces about 4.2 million tons globally, and Cote d'Ivoire will produce just about over 1 million tons, 1.2 to 1.3 million tons per year. Now, cocoa is primarily a smallholder's crop. You can see more than 3 million farmers globally, and 90% of that is produced on smallholder farms. They're at the bottom, 2 to 4 hectares. The problem in cocoa today is that most of the farms are very old, therefore they're low yielding. Farmers have never really been formally trained on how to grow cocoa, so there's issues in how to rehabilitate these older farms. The other issue with cocoa is that it is inherently labor intensive. You can see a standard, a typical cocoa tree in the bottom right hand there with those green pods. About the only way to get those pods off the tree is with a machete or another type of very sharp instrument, one at a time, handheld knives and collection, and then breaking open, you can see on the left, to form a fermentation heap, and then the drying. So far, I would say over 90% of the labor is a manual system. Very, very few modern techniques are in use. Now, how did we become aware of the child labor issue? It first surfaced in September of 2000 from a video program in the UK, and then this was followed the following year by more journalistic information about children working. What Mars did was, together with industry, we felt that this was an industry. The industry was required to respond because it was such a broad issue. It didn't really highlight one company over any other. So there was a collective approach by the largest companies in Europe and the US. As noted, we did a very broad supply chain assessment, and what we found was, yes, in fact, children are working in the supply chain. However, we found they're primarily working in these small family farms. Fortunately, trafficking is a small number, so the things that we're really trying to accomplish is helping the small family farms and the children who are working in hazardous condition on those farms. I mentioned here that the initial efforts that we took on really lacked the context of the broad sector issues. There's 700,000 cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast and more than 500,000 in Ghana. And what we found is that this is a result of a combination of economic and social issues. Some of these critical social issues are shown here. I've mentioned the poverty that exists primarily because of the low yields and a lack of organization of the farms. Simon mentioned 51% of agriculture is done on co-ops. In Cote d'Ivoire, less than 12% of the farmers are members of co-ops, and I would say less than half of those are members of really viable co-ops. The rest of the farms are, as I say here, isolated and with limited market connections. There's clearly poor educational infrastructure and a very informal labor market. Mars determined that we needed to address the cocoa issues on a global basis. And to do this, we formed, beginning in around 2005, a Sustainable Cocoa Initiative. It has three parts. Innovation in cocoa science is primarily around breeding. Technology transfer is primarily around reaching out to the farmers as well as the communities. And we also have a large commitment to purchase cocoa that is certified. In fact, we would like to purchase all of our cocoa as certified by the year 2020. Now, because the Ivory Coast is the largest cocoa producer, we have decided that strategically we want to focus the majority of our efforts there. And so we have a program where we're looking to achieve sustainability throughout the entire sector, and we're following what we call a holistic approach. We're working on productivity at the farm level, but also at communities, as you'll see. It is a long-term program. We have targets reaching out to the year 2020, and it's important that we are working in partnership. This just highlights the two pillars of our approach, and it also notes that we are working in partnership with the Ivorian government through the Ministry of Agriculture and through other key groups within the Ivorian government. This map shows where the project is located. It's west, about 200 kilometers west of Abidjan, in the largest cocoa growing area, typically centered around the village of Subre. Now, in terms of production, our target is to increase cocoa production from the current yields that are really in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 kilos per hectare, all the way up to 1,500 kilos. We're going to do this by establishing demonstration farms that will show farmers how to rehabilitate their old farms. We will then establish what we call cocoa village centers. Think of these as typically just for-profit extension services. Through those CVCs, we will then reach out to a large number of farmers, as you can see here. The linkages between the demonstration farms, the for-profit extension services, and then those for-profit extension services should be able to reach at least 100 farmers each. So our target by 2018 is to reach over 60,000 farmers, and we believe we can see their incomes increase by a factor of at least 3. Now, importantly on here, you see this community linkage. Wherever we form a demonstration farm or the nearby CVCs, we will be working in those communities. The community work is centered around addressing permissive attitudes towards children working, improving the effectiveness of educational services, and of course impacting poverty that persists around those communities. I think one of the important things that we're working on now is the implementation of a child labor monitoring system, and I'll say a bit more about that in this slide. We believe the community-based approach in terms of monitoring is one of the best approaches for really evaluating and understanding how children are working on farms around the community. One of the things that is required is an effective child protection committee in each community, and we are establishing those as we go into those communities. We have a public-private partnership with the ILO, and this is well underway. We hope to be implementing this child labor monitoring in at least 15 communities next year. So just a word about I think I missed a slide. I had mentioned earlier about certification. People hear a lot of different things about certification. Our intention as it relates to certification is to maximize the outreach that we can have to the farmers in the area. Trying to reach 700,000 farmers over the next 10 to 15 years is going to require organization that doesn't currently exist. So whether it's the formation of new co-ops or strengthening current co-ops, we see certification having a role there. It is a way that we can make productivity inputs like fertilizer and planting material more readily available. It still has a place in credible monitoring and auditing, and we know that we need to strengthen those activities as they relate to certification. And I'm sure there'll be some questions about that. Our current results, we've established 21 of the development centers, and by the end of this year we will have 35 for-profit extension systems in place. Our community-driven development is very well underway. We have micro projects going in more than 50 communities, and 17 of those micro projects address needs in education, all the way from classroom blocks to teachers' quarters and to other facilities at the schools. And as I mentioned, the CLMS is now being implemented. Just a couple comments on the key learnings. I think for small household farms existing not only in cocoa, but I'm sure in other agricultural sectors, there's a range of interventions that need to be taking place in order to address the worst forms of child labor. Stakeholders cannot act in isolation. I think this was mentioned by the previous speakers as well. Partnership approaches are critical, and I think there's lots of room for improvement in those partnerships. Support from the government is absolutely necessary. And then some of the key challenges. I think the biggest challenge, not only for cocoa, but for agriculture, where you see these small farm agriculture, is the very dispersed and unorganized nature of many of the farms. I think one of the biggest opportunities is to help those farmers become better organized. The educational deficits that exist in Côte d'Ivoire are dramatic. The Ministry of Education has indicated that at least 10,000 primary schools need built throughout Côte d'Ivoire, and especially in the cocoa sector. That requires input not only from industry, from the government, but from other larger donors, and I think an opportunity certainly exists there. I want to link my last point that the length of time required for change is an increasing concern for those of us in business, and that really relates to this ability and this need to address and to define a better system of measure. Rosa mentioned the importance of being able to assess. I would agree, we have to be able to better measure the incidence of child labor, because how else will we know if our interventions are having an impact? So I think this is an area for much further work, and that is something that I believe is a high priority. So I thank you for the opportunity to tell about what we're doing, and I look forward to some healthy conversation following the presentations. Thank you.